Hello and thank you for joining me today. My name is Jerrel. I develop video games for a living and have shipped numerous titles across the Nintendo 3DS, Wii U, and Switch. Today, I will be giving an explanation from a developer's standpoint regarding how the Switch 2 hardware will allow games to be better, specifically the Pokemon series. I will explain the causes of the performance issues that we saw in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. I will explain how those technical challenges negatively affect a development cycle, and I will explain how the Switch 2 solves those issues. So, in keeping with the title of the video, I will be explaining how the Switch 2 will allow the Pokemon games to be better so that there will not be a repeat of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. So I've just got my save file here. I did not pay someone in China to play this save file for me. This is actually my save file. It's not great, but it's not meant to, I'm not claiming to be the #1 player in the world when it comes to Pokemon. So something that we see, and you may have seen it just there, and this is something that players of the game would have noticed, is sometimes geometry disappears. Sometimes as you turn the camera, things will pop in and out suddenly. What is happening is there is a manual culling process. That means that the game is programmed to manually check if geometry exists within the frame of the camera, and if the object is outside of the frame, then it will just disable the geometry for that. Normally we rely on a technique called frustum culling that does this basically automatically for us. And we don't have to do anything as programmers and developers. We don't need to do anything extra. That's already implemented. So I don't understand why it was implemented, this manual culling. And the manual culling is contributes to some very odd instances. For example, if you've noticed, you are in battle, and sometimes when you open your menu, sometimes shadows will disappear. That means that a part of the terrain is manually being turned off and on. It is a manual process that should not need to occur. The reason why they implemented it is because the developers were trying very hard to optimize anywhere, absolutely anywhere they could, because of the Switch hardware. This game is setting out to achieve something that is just a little too much for the Switch hardware. The scope was a little too big. You'll see popping in and out there. Now, something that we don't see here is true volumetric lighting or true volumetric fog. This appears to be distance fog. So in terms of performance, you basically have a performance budget. And if you use a technique like volumetric lighting or volumetric fog, it is very expensive in terms of your rendering. So it means that there's a performance cost. I will be very careful in this video with the information that I present to you, as I am under NDA, so I'm very careful in the information that I share with you. But this is true across any platform. Volumetric lighting basically is what makes games look like they have density in the atmosphere. It simulates the sense of humidity or dust or dirt. It allows environments to look dense in terms of the air, and it gives depth to the scene. It's generally used very pleasantly. It's quite noticeable, say for example, when you are, say for example, indoors in a dusty building and light is streaming into that building and you see the light rays come in. That is a very good example of volumetric lighting, and it's quite interesting. I'm sorry, the gamer in me will not let me pass up this TM. So against my better judgment, I'm here to explain this video to you, but the gamer in me will not let me leave these items. So the reason, the way that we can tell, I've gotten into a battle here. I will have to escape post-haste. I shall run away. The way we can tell that this does not use volumetric fog, well, one, the game would run significantly slower even still, is if we put the light behind the trees there, we do not have volumetric light shafts. What we have is post-processing light shafts. This is an effect that is applied afterwards that's actually not very expensive. This technique is quite primitive. It's been around for a long time, and it's a very effective way. It's a cheap way in terms of performance to simulate more complexity in the lighting, where it's actually quite cheap to have that. So, as I said before, distance fog is quite cheap to render. I explained in my video taking a look at the Switch 2 announcement trailer and the Mario Kart 9, or the new Mario Kart video that they showed us that has true volumetric lighting. And it is rendered at high resolution. As developers, we can pick if that volumetric lighting is rendered in low or high resolution. And on Switch hardware, it's extremely expensive, so games that use volumetric lighting generally render it at very low resolutions. Breath of the Wild uses volumetric lighting, and this is something that will allow developers, because the Switch 2 will not force developers to spend a significant amount of time optimizing. That means that the developers can spend their time actually creating the game, improving the game itself. Working on Switch hardware is quite inhibiting because you have to spend a significant amount of time cutting parts of your game down, paring it down, engineering new solutions just so you could have slightly better performance using the Switch hardware. I can tell that the developers of Pokemon wanted to do so much more with the games Scarlet and Violet. I can tell they wanted to do so much more, but I can see as a developer they had to dedicate a significant amount of time optimizing and re-optimizing and just scraping any performance they can get out of the system. Something we see here is a subsurface scattering, or a simulated subsurface scattering. You can see light coming through the trees. It is an extremely pleasant visual effect, and it's basically standard. If you look at modern games, they have subsurface scattering. It means that it simulates light entering an object, bouncing around within that object, and then the light exiting through the object. If you go outside, you have a look at grass and trees, you look at the way that the sun hits those objects, it gives that sense of depth to that object, that it is not just this fake piece of plastic. It is something that has organic quality to it. We have a very basic version of it here, but it still is nice to see in the trees. You can see the light sort of illuminating the trees and the light bouncing out of the leaves, but it is still something that is quite costly in terms of performance. So that has a performance implication. There is something here that we see as well. As geometry gets close to the camera, you can see that we have screen door transparency. Every piece of geometry in Pokemon is able to do this. I've noticed as they've updated and improved the games, they have improved on this a bit. But basically, as geometry gets closer to the camera, it goes through various stages of screen door transparency so that the geometry does not block the view of the camera. In my opinion, it is unnecessary, especially in this situation, because having that incurs a performance cost. Again, this causes a hit to performance. This causes the frame rate to drop because this has to calculate how close is this geometry to the camera, how transparent should it be, and then the screen door transparency itself has some performance cost. You can see something that they did adjust and fine-tune over patches to alleviate this is that the grass used to have more transparency. It used to be more proactive in terms of becoming transparent as it got closer to the camera, but that means that basically every clump of grass would have a significant impact on performance because of that, because it's constantly calculating the distance to the camera, it's calculating how transparent it needs to be. As we saw with the detailed density in Mario Kart 9, or the Switch 2 trailer, I'll just refer to it as a Switch 2 trailer now, that is something that will not be an issue. It shows us that that sort of brute force exists on the Switch 2 hardware, so we don't need to worry about the culling having an impact. We don't need to worry about the screen door proximity having an impact. One very strong impact, a significant impact on performance in these Pokemon games is transparent particles. On any hardware, one of the most expensive things to draw in terms of your rendering budget that causes a negative impact on your performance is transparent particles. And unfortunately, with this game in particular, or these games, there are many transparent pixels and transparent particles. You can see the items in the distance there. You have items everywhere. Even if they are behind the terrain, they are still being rendered, even if you cannot see them. You see we have fog over there in the distance, and then we have the sparkles letting you know where the dens are. They let you know where the items are. And all of that has a significant performance cost. Even though it does not seem like it, there is a significant performance cost because of that. And on Switch hardware, rendering transparent pixels is one of the most expensive things. It may not seem like it's a big deal, but it really is. We also have the water. And water uses more advanced rendering because it is complex in its reflections. It has to reflect the geometry around it, and it also deforms the view of the geometry below it. This is quite expensive. And the problem with this is that even though we cannot see the water, it is still being rendered. So we have the cost of that. See, if I'm standing here, even though I cannot see that water, it is still being rendered. And in this environment, there are dozens of pieces of water, of geometry using that water shader. And a shader is basically a set of instructions that tells the game how geometry is supposed to look. So even though it looks like there isn't much here, we actually have the dust particles, we have the water rendering, that even though we can't see it, it's still being rendered. We have the item particles, the den particles, any Pokemon that have particle effects to them. We also have the clouds that are in the sky that are moving. All of those transparent particles have a significant performance cost. We have these real-time shadows that are quite low resolution. If you have a look at the character here, these are not the same as these blob shadows. These blob shadows are very basic, and they use a technique that is much cheaper in terms of budget for the rendering. So they have not as heavy a performance cost as real-time shadows as these characters cast. You see the shadows, if we find something to look at here. We'll have a look at the shadow of the tree here. See that tree casts a shadow underneath it. And as we back away from it, it's culled very quickly. See, the tree there is not even drawing its own shadow anymore. Now, the artists were able to alleviate this issue a little bit by actually painting the terrain, and the terrain is actually a bit darker underneath it, under this spot. I'm not sure if they necessarily do this everywhere, but I have noticed it just there. You can see the grass being culled, and that is because this grass is actually quite expensive to render in terms of performance. It has to calculate the wind bending, but also you see that it has to calculate collision with the player. So it's calculating collisions using mathematical functions for simulating a sense of wind. Of course, there is the highlights feature that helps there to be dynamic depth in terms of the lights and the darks that lets you know that this is a living environment with organic material that is moving around. But all of that costs something. And all of these things add up together. If it was just one thing at a time, if the Switch only needed to render one thing, it would not be a big deal. But because it is all of these things that puts a strain on the Switch. So to me, I would assume, based on my experiences with the Switch, the developers probably spent, and because of the state of these games when they launch, I would say that they probably spent around 40% of their development time just optimizing and trying to make the game run decently. And I say that because there are still significant issues with performance. One issue that we have as well is I believe we're loading, it's possible that we are loading textures and models on the fly because there's significant stuttering as we reach new areas. Materials start out low resolution. If you have a see there, these are a technique that is referred to as MIP mapping. And MIP mapping allows us to have lower quality or lower resolution textures at a distance, and then as we approach, we get higher resolution textures. So if we have a look at the Poke Center there, you can see that it is quite low resolution, and then as we approach, the textures will become higher resolution. This is something that we have to do for performance sake. We want to have lower resolution textures at distance because, again, it's cheaper to draw for the renderer. But in the Switch 2 reveal trailer, we saw that the signs that were around the Mario Kart racetrack were very high resolution, very sharp, even though they were very far from the camera. That tells us that the Switch 2 has so much brute force that MIP mapping probably isn't really that big of a deal. But as you reach new areas, as you have to load in geometry while the game is running, that causes stuttering. That contributes to the overall behavior and performance, and also the time that you can spend during development. Here you can also see that the real-time shadows are actually only being updated not every frame. You know, it's maybe once every half second or so. And I'm not entirely sure what technique they are using, because here's the thing, I'm not seeing that particular shadow affect the character here, and that is interesting to me. It has the same resolution as the character, so it looks like it should be real-time shadows, but the fact that it is not affecting the player character geometry, the fact that it is updating stuttering, to me tells me that they really struggled with the performance. To me, this is a sign that they spent significant time. They explored numerous options. They tried likely everything that they thought they could try in order to make the game run better, but it just was not enough. So this to me is very telling that a significant portion of their development time was spent trying to optimize. And when you do that, it means that there's significantly less time for you to work on the actual game. It means that there will be less polish on the gameplay mechanics. It means that there is less time for balancing, for creating content. Content will likely have to be cut. And that's just what happens when you lose development time to basically fighting the hardware, fighting the game engine itself. And that is the whole point of pointing out these issues, is that these are things that the development team tried to deal with, and to me it is clear that they spent a significant amount of time working on it. It goes without saying that obviously with the Switch 2 will have higher resolution textures on everything, and that's not important to point out. That doesn't really help us with anything like that. We see, even as the character models get farther from the screen, they switch to a lower level of detail. We refer to it as an LOD for short, and that they are lower poly count so that it's easier to render. When we saw the Switch 2 reveal trailer with Mario Kart 9, that did not seem to be very noticeable. So that means that their LODs can occur at much farther away before there's a negative impact. Something that we see with the trees as well. If we have a look at the trees, you'll see the level of detail change very obviously with the trees. Did you see the trees suddenly flicker and then their graphical style changed? So what we're looking at that tree in the distance, that is likely a billboard, which means it is actually one flat polygon. It's just flat. As we get closer, you'll see the tree in the background will just flicker, and suddenly it will no longer be a billboard. It will actually be a piece of geometry. It happened just there. You can see that the flags here do not have cloth simulation. They don't simulate physics. These are baked animations, so that is preset, which means that they are also predictable, and they both are exactly the same animation. So it's predictable. They're both moving the exact same way. As we move farther away, you can see it switches to a simplified version of that animation, and it just breaks the immersion a little bit. When we saw the Switch 2 reveal trailer with Mario Kart 9, we saw the flags. All of the flags waving were behaving differently. None of them had the same animation in terms of how they're billowing in the wind. I had a number of comments of people saying, oh, those flags are baked animations. They're baked, they're preset animations. What I saw in that trailer was that each flag was behaving differently. This is a baked animation. You can tell it's baked because they're doing the exact same thing. In the Mario Kart 9 trailer, the flags were not doing the same thing, which to me tells me that it is using cloth simulation, is using physics simulation, and if they can afford to have cloth physics simulation on background elements such as flags at that scale and that degree, it tells me that the Switch 2 hardware just has very efficient hardware for processing that, and it tells me that the Switch 2 has brute strength to where cloth simulation is not that demanding, and it's something that the Switch 2 can handle very easily. We didn't really see the foliage, any foliage in the Mario Kart 9 video that they showed us, but foliage is something that is actually quite expensive to render, especially on the Switch, and trees end up looking quite basic, especially as I showed when you have the level of detail and they turn into billboards. But based on what I've seen from the Mario Kart 9 trailer, it's very likely that the next time we see more footage from Nintendo about the Switch 2, when we see foliage, we are going to have the hyper-dense, extremely realistic type of foliage that we see in PC games, that we see on the PlayStation and Xbox consoles. This is a situation where performance gets even worse because now we have rain particles to process. We often see the geometry in the distance is quite obviously significantly more basic. And of course, these are all signs of having to just optimize as much as possible. So those are some things that I just wanted to discuss and point out. I hope the video has been interesting to you. I'm a massive fan and supporter of all these games, and of course they have their flaws, and when there are issues like this, it is important to discuss them in a reasonable and intelligent manner so people can understand what the issues are. This is what allows developers, engineers, artists, it's what allows people to understand the flaws in our current approaches and to make improvements so that we can do better. There is a big difference between criticizing something just because you dislike it and criticizing something because your goal is to help it improve. We see the frame rate stuttering here quite brutally, and I am strongly confident this is something that we will not see. I am confident based on the Switch 2 reveal trailer, this will not happen again on the Switch 2. I can see, as a developer, I can see that the Switch 2 has significant brute strength to where the development team that works on Pokemon, they will no longer have to waste their time on these kinds of optimizations, and they will be able to spend their time making the best gameplay experience for us. That is the takeaway of this video here, is that the developers will be able to focus on making the best game they can, on putting as much content in as they can, and they won't have to worry about spending so much time on engineering solutions and optimizing the way that they have had here. The games will look even better, and I'm confident that the games that we see on the Switch 2 will be the absolute best that we've seen on any Nintendo console. I'm very much looking forward to developing for the Switch 2, though I have not requested access to a development kit yet because I'm too busy at the moment finishing up my current Switch titles, and I'll be bringing games to the Steam as well. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. I will put a link to just a funny video if you'd like to see a funny video that I've done. Thank you very much. Please take care of yourselves. Be well, everyone. We're going fishing tomorrow. Grab your fishing poles. I've got all the gear we need, so we'll go fishing. And just have a nice, relaxing day. Take care. I'll see you.